I'm sewing a classic French couture jacket today, inspired by the iconic design of Gabrielle Chanel. In part 1, I explored the best patterns, fabrics and trims, and created and fitted a toile. I also began testing couture techniques I have learned from masters like Claire Shaeffer and Susan Kalji, many of which I'm using here for the first time. In this video, I assembled the jacket and applied the hand-finished details that give it that unmistakable je ne sais quoi. As I stitch, I reflect on Chanel's life and on a pivotal encounter in the 1920s that quietly shaped the course of the House of Chanel in ways you may not have known. If you missed the first part, I will link it at the end. I'm so glad you're here to share this journey with me. Paris, autumn of 1921, 31 Rue Cambon. A third-floor studio apartment. 2 women, hunched over a table scattered with pieces of crimson crepe de chine, finished with intricate machine embroidery, are engrossed in a heated argument. "I'm telling you, Madame Bataille, that I cannot pay 600 francs for this work." "But, mademoiselle, will you allow me to call her attention to what, Madame Bataille?" "I wish you would tell me the reasons for charging me this ridiculous price. As I have told you already, I cannot see them at all myself." "Mademoiselle, the blouse is embroidered with real Chinese silk, 1 kilo of which costs at this present time—" "I do not care what kind of silk you use, real or artificial. It is none of my business. What I want is to sell the blouse. As it is too expensive, therefore you must charge less for it. That is all." "But, mademoiselle—" "Ma chère, it is, it seems to me, quite as much in your interest as it is in mine to produce this in large quantities. You must understand this and be reasonable. Come down on your price. You're not the only one to make embroidery in Paris, and anybody would be only too delighted to do the work for me. You can take it or leave it. That's all." When Madame Bataille left, another woman who had been sitting quietly in the room observing this rather one-sided conversation gathered her courage and spoke. "Mademoiselle Chanel, if I could embroider that blouse for you for 150 francs less, would you give me the order?" "Why, certainly, but the blouse is machine embroidered. Do you know anything about machine embroidery?" "Well, nothing whatever, but since this is embroidered by machine, perhaps I might be able to find one and learn to work it." "Well, you can always try." This was my best and only one-time impersonation of Chanel and Maria, but I'm not making this up. I am actually reading from a book written by Maria Pavlovna. So this is a memoir, one of the 2 books that Maria wrote in the 30s when she lived in the United States, and this book is called A Princess in Exile. So I happen to have a copy that was published in the United States in New York in 1932, and this copy, let me show you, has her original signature of the Grand Duchess of Russia. I want to quote one more thing because I think Maria very, very intelligently and insightfully gave the most accurate definition of who Chanel really was. And a lot of the biographies that I read about Chanel quote that episode specifically that took place in Chanel's Atelier on Rue Cambon, but also her definition of Chanel. So listen to this. "In the autumn of 1921, I met Mademoiselle Chanel, the most successful dressmaker in Paris since the war and a promising businesswoman. Europe had very few businesswomen and refused to take them seriously, but her brilliant talents had begun to attract general attention. She became a dressmaker during the war and entirely by accident." That's very important. "She chose the career not because she had a particular vocation for it, but because it offered her the biggest opportunities within her own limitations. Had she begun life in different circumstances and possessed the necessary training, she would have become an important executive in any field of business she had chosen." How insightful is that? Deep down, what Chanel really was a woman who wanted to be independent and stand strongly on her own feet. And she would use clothes as a means to achieve that goal. And she did not possess any of the sort of attributes of a talented, creative designer that we associated with high fashion, because it is well known that Chanel had basic sewing skills. She didn't know how to draw. She didn't know how to cut patterns and how to execute her ideas on paper, which is what you have to do before you cut into the fabric. Her entire life, as you may well know, she preferred to work on live models and do the draping. And I'm saying this not to point out her negatives, right, the limitations, but actually to point out that despite all that, you know, she didn't have the opportunities to learn all of that, but what she did have is this incredible vision and incredible kind of ability to sense, to see the opportunities presented to her, and clothes were one of the ways for her to achieve her financial goals. She created sort of a silhouette, a look that was very different from what women would wear at the time, and by design. Like, she would wear it herself, and she would have women friends from the society who were brought to her boutiques by the wealthy man who financed her at first. And those women would buy and demonstrate. And what works better than for us women when we see other women wearing something? You know, all the social media platforms that sell things to us operate that way. That's pure marketing. And so that worked brilliantly for her. What women would wear and how women would behave during that time was changing, and she quickly recognized that. So that ability to see opportunities and jump on them and make something out of nothing, fake it till you make it, if you will, was that brilliant trait that she had that carried her through her entire life. Let's get back to the jacket. I have it flat on my surface here because I'm in the process of applying interfacing to the bottom of the jacket before I can fully assemble it. And the easiest way to do it is when it's not sewn at the shoulders, but it's flat on my table. What I'm doing is I'm applying a Wigan, apparently, as I learned in couture sewing. So what it is, it's just the interfacing that I'm applying to the bottom of the jacket that was cut out of a cotton fabric. It's cut on the bias. It's rather thin but sturdy cotton. I didn't have the proper Wigan fabric that's used in technique, but I didn't think it was really that necessary in my case. I'm just trying out those techniques. And what it's going to do is it will allow me to create a really nice finish to the bottom of my jacket. So I will pin the Wigan seam allowance to seam allowance, right? And then I will secure it by hand with just a catch stitch to that seam allowance. And then once it's done, I will fold my jacket hem over that Wigan. I'll make sure that I trim it and make it even, and that creates sort of a little bit of a rounded sort of finish for the bottom of the jacket, which is what the couture jackets are known for. As I meticulously work on this jacket, stitch by stitch, I find myself thinking about the two women in our story and the losses they had endured by the time they met. In 1921, Gabrielle was 38 and Maria was 31. I invite you to reflect on your own journey with me and the losses that shape us more than we realize. As children, we may lose a parent, a beloved pet, a home. Sometimes it's death. Sometimes it is betrayal by an adult we trusted. Something breaks inside, and we're never quite the same. Then we grow up, and the losses deepen. We may lose a partner, a child, God forbid, friends, family members, a country, an identity, our sense of freedom, and every era carries its own toll. Loss is inevitable, and when we are deep inside it, life can feel impossible to bear. Some try to end the pain literally. Others look for places to hide. We reach for relief wherever we can find it. And drugs, alcohol, obsessions, even things that look good from the outside can become escape. We overspend, we overeat, we over-exercise, we bury ourselves in work. There are countless ways to avoid the fear, the anger, the desperation. And often, what we avoid most is simply facing it, allowing ourselves to fully feel it, to grieve, to sit with it long enough to understand what it takes from us. And only then, slowly, can we begin releasing it and claiming our lives and ourselves back. As the story continues, you will see how, as adult women, Gabrielle and Maria chose differently. Both were wounded, both shaped by profound loss and circumstances outside their control. But when faced with conscious choices at pivotal moments in their lives, they chose differently and their paths diverged in entirely different directions. As a young woman, Gabrielle fell in love and was in a relationship for almost a decade with one man. Arthur Capel was known to be the true one love of her life, and you may say she lost him twice. Capel married someone else, a society woman Chanel didn't belong to. Yet they remained close after his marriage, and a year later she lost him again in a car crash. This devastated her. She was changed again, forever. She found herself at that pivotal moment where she had to make a choice. I imagine she poured herself into work, into one affair after another, closing in on herself, becoming more guarded, more suspicious, hiding the truth of her past, burning bridges with her family, entering relationships that felt transactional rather than genuine, and slowly shaping a life that could only lead to isolation. Maria lost her first child to court rulings and spent her life searching for ways to reunite. She remarried and bore another child, but when she and her husband were forced to flee the country because of the revolution, it was too dangerous to take their newborn with them. While they struggled towards safety, the child died of a disease. Many of her family members were assassinated. Others scattered across the globe. She lost most of what her world once was, and also faced a difficult choice. And yet Maria turned outward. She found strength in serving others who shared her fate. She gathered people, she united them, built new identities from the ruins of the old ones. She chose genuine connection. And as I painstakingly align each seam of this jacket, I am reminded that we cannot control what is taken from us. But perhaps slowly and gently we can choose what we build from it going forward. I want to take another small break and show you a book that is fascinating, that actually I'm so glad it just came in the mail from, oh my God, Milan. I found it in the United States, but it was way too expensive, and so I ordered it from Milan and it came, and I will link it where I bought it and what it is. It is written by Nadia Albertini. It's co-authored by her. Nadia Albertini, if you don't know, she is an embroidery and a textile artist. I believe Nadia lives in Paris, but she works all around Europe and traveled a lot, and so she's an expert on embroidery. And she wrote among her books this one that's called Kitmir. And Kitmir is the name of the embroidery atelier that Maria Pavlovna established, the one that collaborated with Chanel, at first exclusively. And that started in 1921. So she wasn't kidding, Maria wasn't afraid of a challenge. She was no stranger to hard work. Before she came to Paris, she lived in London for a little bit, and when the money started running out, she started knitting sweaters and trying to sell them to different boutiques. And she was successful, but it was very little money, not enough. So when a lot of these women from Maria's background, they fled Russia and settled in European cities, in Paris, a lot of them, they started selling off their jewels, whatever they could bring. And jewelry, as beautiful as it is considered and historic, right, and kind of elevated art pieces, right, they really were treated by the royal family more like currency, just money, and they very often would be broken down into pieces and sold off. Or if they could find a buyer, like a prestigious jewelry house in Paris, that they would sell it. And so that happened to a lot of jewels that Maria had. And so she sold off some of that jewelry to finance that Kitmir operation. She did go and find an embroidery machine, and she learned how to embroider, use the machine herself. She had a very deep understanding and deep roots in embroidery. You know, embroidery in my country dates back many, many centuries before, and the motifs that were so popular in Paris in the 20s during the Russian period, they date back to the Byzantine Russia, where along with the religion, a lot of those techniques of embroidery with silk threads and a lot of designs were brought in, and women in the Romanov family always studied embroidery, and they even opened an academy in St. Petersburg for women of sort of their blood as well as common women to go and study this skill. And then she continued, as you know, in Sweden to learn other techniques. So she was very familiar with the techniques, with the materials. She had a beautiful artistic vision. She knew how to draw very well and design. So this was not a challenge for her. The challenge was to learn the machine embroidery to mass produce, because Chanel was focused on mass production. She was a businesswoman. She couldn't care less how much labor goes into anything, but what she did care about is for it to be quality and affordable, so that then she could make garments out of those fabrics and sell them off in mass, because she quickly realized couture, the way it existed back then, when only very few limited number of pieces were made for exclusive small circle, that's not the way to make a fortune. So anyway, so Maria financed her operation, found the machine, learned how to operate. She hired Russian women to help her out. And one of the motives for her to do that was not only to provide for herself and her immediate family, but also to employ and give resources to a lot of women who came to Europe and were completely lost. So Maria happened to be a very strong woman who wasn't afraid of hard work, who wasn't afraid to try, and who decided at the beginning that because the life has changed, the world is a different place, that she was determined to make something of it and make something of herself in that new reality. And so before she came, you know, during World War I, she actually trained as a nurse, and she worked for 2 years on the front lines, operating a hospital and being a nurse and serving people. So deep inside of her was this desire to help, to elevate women, to help them out, to create the community and support. And so she donated a lot of money. One of the reasons, not the main reason, but one of the reasons that her business wasn't as successful as it could have been, the Atelier, was because of her generosity and how she used the money that was made by it. But anyway, Nadia Albertini goes in detail into the beautiful, beautiful history of that collaboration between Chanel and Maria Pavlovna, and they benefited from each other. So they found each other at the pivotal moments in their lives, personally and professionally, and they helped each other, right? So Maria saw that a woman could become financially independent, can stand on her own feet, and can really make something of her life. And watching Chanel, she acquired some of those skills from Chanel, while Chanel certainly benefited from the wonderful embroideries and creations by Kitmir and other Russian smaller production ateliers that existed. If you remember, I was cutting out the shapes out of silk organza for interfacing, right? And I do those on the bottoms of the sleeves, as well as there is a piece, as you saw, the larger piece that was cut for the bottom of the jacket, for the hem of the jacket. However, when I started assembling, I realized that the silk organza just wouldn't simply be enough. And so instead, I decided to use a pretty heavy, sturdy cotton fabric, which I treated, pre-shrunk, and I cut those interfacings out of that fabric. And now what you see here, they don't have seam allowances, so I cut off the seam allowances at the bottom and on the sides, and I placed it inside my sleeve, on the inside of the sleeve, within seam allowances, right? So you can see those red lines that I have traced before. They go on all sides. These are seam allowances, and I basted it in place, so make sure that it's held in the right position. Then what I will be doing now is I will be pinning that the seam allowance for the sleeve, right? And in my case, it's a little bit more than 5/8. My fabric does not fray as much as I thought it would, so I have the luxury of cutting the seams pretty close. But if you're not sure, make sure that the seam allowance is much wider, at least an inch. And then you would pin. Your seam allowances that you traced will be a very good guide for you. And then you will pin to make sure that everything is neatly tucked. You will pin over your interfacing, and interfacing then will be cut inside by hand stitching, so it's not going to move anywhere. But while you're working with it, it's a good practice to secure it with basting, and this is what I did. It is also cut on the bias, so it has quite a bit of give, but it also gives stability. So when it's all finished, it will give it stability. And so what you do, you continue going around. And here, you know, there is a corner here. So, and when you're going to be closing this inside, right, and finishing, so sometimes those edges would show up. And so what I learned, there is an interesting technique that you can use where you could actually cut straight into that corner, right? So you cut almost to the corner, not quite, but just, right, let's cut like so. And then take a small amount of this fabric, like a little triangle out, right? So you create a little space in between them, and then you connect. When you pin them in place, right, then you connect the two cut edges like so. You create a bit of an angle, right? A bit of an angle, you meet them, and then you put a pin inside to where the seam allowance is going, right, or where the seam, the stitching line is, and then you fold it over. You see what I mean? So there is this little angle that is being created that helps hide those corners. And when you're stitching, when you are securing it with a thread, and you're going to be doing this by hand, and I'll show you how I do this, right? And then just continue. So when you're sewing it by hand, you will also make sure that you secure all those corners, but it allows you to hide so much better. You know, I need to hide it a bit more inside. So essentially you're creating a mitered corner, right, like this. There are two ways to finish the vent, and both are correct, and both are used in couture from what I learned. So usually when you cut your sleeve, right, you have one side that has an extension, right, kind of like a rectangular shape extension. And this is an overlap, right? And in some applications, for example, Susan Kalji, she uses that overlap on top of the sleeve. And essentially, this is what it's going to look like when you finish your jacket. This overlap, this piece will look like so on top. And she uses the trim that goes all around the perimeter of the sleeve, goes inside, and then continues here and continues along the perimeter here. So she reinforces the whole thing. In Claire's application, it's the other way around. This extended part goes inside and that provides that support. And her sleeve is finished with a clean line. And it goes on top of this, and let me straighten that. So it goes on top of that extended part, and then she applies the trim just to the very edge of it, and then around the perimeter, and hides inside the sleeve. So this is the vent opening, and in either way, the vent opening will be facing the back of the arm, the back piece of the sleeve. So I'm using Claire's application. Reason for that is that my fabric is rather lightweight, and I think when you apply the trim to the perimeter of this extended piece, it makes it really heavy. Regardless of the application, you will need to manipulate those seams and spread them open so you could construct the actual sleeve. So close those seams together to create to finish the sleeve, right? And so in order to do that, you will have to clip into the seam. And usually you would reinforce it. And not just by stitching it, but I added a square of silk organza, as you can see. I could have extended this interfacing a little bit longer, but I think it is a bit too thick for this application, so I chose to do the silk organza instead on both ends. And then I just simply used sharp scissors and clipped into the corner without clipping the stitches. The Russian period in Chanel history is extremely important, as I pointed out. Also because, you know, it lasted for a few years only, but it was like a major trend that Chanel recognized had potential to make something to just benefit from. And Chanel had a lot of Russian influential friends in the arts. You know, she collaborated with the Diaghilev and with the Ballet Russe and supported the Ballet Russe and created the costumes for them. She knew Stravinsky, she knew a lot of artists who later also worked, some of them worked for designing her fabrics. She eventually would own the mills where the fabrics were created exclusively for her. She dated Dmitri, Maria's brother, and it is not a legend, but it's proven that Dmitri gave Chanel some of the pieces of jewelry from the imperial collection, and one of them were like multiple strands of real pearls, which Chanel really, really loved, and they became really the core of the look of Chanel. We cannot separate the Chanel look and the pearls, but what she did with them, she elevated them, she made them the look. She made the look accessible to masses, again, simply because she used artificial faux pearls. The famous Chanel No. 5 also, you know, had some roots, because the Ernest Beau, who created Chanel No. 5, you know the story. He created a few scents, and Chanel picked No. 5. From that series that he created. But Ernest Beau was born and raised in Russia, although he was born to a French family. And he lived and he became the chief perfumer and worked at the factory that supplied perfume and other cosmetic products to the imperial family. And when the revolution happened, because of his ties to the imperial family, it wasn't safe any longer, so he left and settled in France. As shrewd a businesswoman as Chanel was, she made one mistake that would haunt her for years. When the deal for financing, producing and distributing Chanel No. 5 was signed, she did not foresee what it would become. To her, it was simply meant to be a signature scent for her salon clientele, an elegant extension of her brand. But that small bottle would take on a life of its own, traveling far beyond her boutique on Rue Cambon, crossing borders and oceans and becoming a global phenomenon. In 1924, she partnered with the Jewish brothers Pierre and Paul Wertheimer, owners of the highly successful perfume Bourjois, along with Théophile Beda, founder of the department stores Galeries Lafayette, to create perfumes Chanel and commercialize the new fragrance. 70% went to the Wertheimer brothers, 20% to Beda, and Chanel, the creator of the name, the vision and the mystique, retained only 10%. As the perfume's success exploded, those 10% became a source of deep resentment. She had signed away control of what would become the financial engine of her empire. For years, she tried to renegotiate the terms and reclaim full ownership. And now we arrive at the part of the story I truly dislike, but I cannot ignore, because this is where the icon fades and the human being stands exposed. During the Nazi occupation of France, Chanel attempted to use the new regime's anti-Jewish laws to reclaim the business from the Wertheimers, unsuccessfully. Before the brothers left France for the United States for safety, they had transferred control of the company to a non-Jewish business person, Felix Amiot, who was accidentally in the business of supplying aircraft parts to the German Luftwaffe. Now, that was hardly the kind of person the Nazis would question, so Chanel failed. This is not where the story ends, by the way. Just wait and see how ironic life can be sometimes. The stories of our women are hard for me to continue. You know, I mentioned earlier that it took me a very long time to wrap my brain around how to tell Chanel's story, and that is because, if you haven't picked up on that just yet, that is because I really dislike that woman as a human being. Because I think there are people in life, and sometimes they are the closest people to you. Sometimes they are the loved family members. So people who might have been hurt in life early on, and then they carry that hurt and that pain their entire lives, and somehow believe that because of that, everything and everybody owes them something. And they act that way. When people put themselves above others for some reason, thinking that, you know, they're better and therefore they deserve more, and therefore no matter what means they use to get what they want, without much regard for other people, I have to draw the line here. This is where my tolerance stops. So at the end of the 20s, the Maria's and Chanel's paths diverged, and they went their own ways. I'm not going to go into detail. There's so much more to tell. But I would just tell you that Maria continued on that path of trying to surround herself with the family and trying to reclaim some of the things that were taken away from her by building something new. She did reconcile and reunite with her son, who was a grown man, and Maria died at a very early age. She died in Germany while she was living with her son and his family. Maria, after she left Kitmir, went on to pursue other creative endeavors, and she was collaborating with Vogue as a reporter, as a writer. She became quite a successful photographer. She did a lot of creative things. She wrote the 2 memoirs, and for her this was one of the ways of releasing that past, of sharing it gently, providing those lessons from it and letting it go, releasing it into the world. While Chanel continued, obviously, building her empire, and throughout the 40s, when the war was raging and the German occupation, or Nazi, I should say, occupation of France continued, she continued living in that Ritz-Carlton hotel that was the headquarters of Luftwaffe, and wining and dining with the German officers, while about 2 miles away, you know what happened in July of 1942, that major operation where thousands upon thousands of Jewish people were rounded up and held at a velodrome, and then only to be sent a few days later into the concentration camps, children, women, men. I get choked up talking about this, and some things in life, I think, are important to remember. Some things, however ugly and uncomfortable they are to talk about, I think are really important for us to look at and talk about, simply because if we don't, if we look away continuously, if we make it a norm, if we okay it, no matter how many years go by, I think the history has this ugly and scary way of repeating itself. And we're seeing this in this world again and again. So, not to make it all grave, I think you get the point. As I apply the finishes to the front of the jacket, its classic familiar look slowly emerges under my fingers. And I must remind you of how this look really came to be. While the prototype of an unstructured, collarless jacket appeared in the 1920s, made from jerseys and tweeds, it fully re-entered the fashion scene in the early 50s. Chanel closed her couture house at the start of the war and stepped away from fashion for nearly 15 years. When she returned in 1954 at the age of 71, she reintroduced what would become the now iconic Chanel suit. And it was a flop. And then another one. The French press was unforgiving. Some found the look very outdated. Many had not forgiven her for wartime behavior. Her return could have ended in failure had she not turned to UK and especially the US. Geographically removed from the occupation and its immediate wounds, the American market responded differently. Influential editors and buyers recognized the modern practicality of the suit, its comfort, its ease, and the suit took off there, reigning ever since.
Chanel also continued focusing on the mass market. Unlike other couture houses, Chanel never objected to her designs being copied and reproduced. She understood that imitation means visibility and money. Much of what Americans wore were masterfully produced adaptations rather than original couture pieces. I can't help but wonder, had it not been for America, would she have remained an icon?
I'm almost there, I promise. This is the skirt, the lining is in, so I am just, ow, pins. I'm just closing that up and cleaning that up, but I wanted to leave you with one final thought, or food for thought. Remember how I said life can be very ironic? You know, when Chanel decided to come back in 1954 and restart her fashion house, she needed money to do that. She didn't have the resources enough to do that. And so she needed people to finance it, and the people who did finance her return were the Wertheimer's brothers. The family still owns the brand, and so essentially from 1954 till her death in 1971, when she died at the age of 87, she didn't own her brand, she didn't own her name. On paper, she was a creative director of the brand, and all she had was work, but essentially everything she owned, the Ritz-Carlton suite where she lived and died, all of her possessions, all of her belongings and decorations at the suite, everything essentially, and all her expenses were paid, and there was even a provision in the agreement that Wertheimers will take care of her funeral, so she sold off everything. So I find this ironic that a person who would be working so hard to gain independence will end up that way. And we can say that, you know, it secured her life in the old age, and she was very comfortable, and she did, and she lived a comfortable life, but a lonely one as well. And as a very old woman, when interviewed one time, and I watched it myself, it's still out on the internet, you can look it up, when she was asked how she felt about women and what's important, and as a very old woman, she said that a woman who is not loved is null, she said, is zero, is nobody. It doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter who you are, if you're not loved, if you're not with someone, you're nobody. I find that even more ironic coming from a woman who really wanted to establish her independence from a man, from the world, would end up saying something like that. And it's sad, it made me sad. So, I'll give you one of my poetry moments. It's a beautiful poem that I like by Yeats that sort of describes a little bit those last moments of Chanel's life. But I'm going to leave you to contemplate what this all means and where the irony is. So, and after that, finally, the reveal. Let's do it.
When you're old and grey and full of sleep and nodding by the fire, take down this book and slowly read and dream of the soft look your eyes had once and of their shadows deep. How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love, false or true. But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face. And bending down beside the glowing bars, murmur a little sadly how love fled, and paced upon the mountains overhead, and hid his face amid a crowd of stars.